the beautiful thing about influencing leaders is when you influence a leader, you're not just influencing one, you're influencing everyone that leader influences. So indirectly, you may be influencing tens of thousands of people and not even know it.
What's up, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Mullins Mustard Podcast, where we talk about all things leadership, and we talk about it with industry-leading experts. As always, if we're adding value to you, your life, your family, your organizations, please let us know. Do us a favor, leave a rating and review wherever you listen to the podcast. If you'd like to watch the podcast, you can do so on the Humble Leader Development YouTube page. This episode is brought to you by the fine people at Humble Leader Development. Humble Leader Development is a leadership organization that strives to make people and organizations better through speaking, training, and consultation. If you want to find out more about Humble Leader Development, check them out at humbleleaderdevelopment.com. This is episode 1 of my interview with Doug Smith, who is the founder of L3 Leadership and the Director of Development at Light of Life Rescue Mission in Pittsburgh. He was so gracious and so vulnerable during our conversation and really helped speak inspiration into leaders everywhere. He talked about struggles and personal loss. He talked about resiliency, and he even took us on a brief journey of what it means to take a quiet retreat and reflect about where God wants to send you. I hope you enjoy my interview with Doug Smith. Doug, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for being on here today.
Honored to be here, Jeremy.
For everybody that doesn't know who Doug Smith is, Doug's the Director of Development out of the Light of Life Rescue Mission up in Pittsburgh, the founder of L3 Leadership. You get married to your wife, Laura. You guys 10 years today, as a matter of fact, as we're recording this podcast. That's awesome.
I thought what better to do on my 10-year anniversary than be with you, Jeremy.
I'm so honored. But you guys have 3 kids, right? Got a 4th on the way, if I understand that.
You got it, man. We find out the sex today, so.
Man, you life is coming at you hard and fast, right? What else you want people to know about you, man?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just to dive a little bit into each of those, you mentioned Light of Life Rescue Mission. So I oversee all the fundraising for the organization, fundraising, marketing, events, and volunteering. And we're a nonprofit in Pittsburgh that serves the homeless men, women, and children of our city. And I've been doing that for 70 years. So that's my day job. That's what I'm very, very passionate about. And I've been there for 11 years, which is crazy to me. And then you mentioned L3 Leadership, which is how we connected. I also have a podcast that comes out weekly, and I've been doing that for 10 years, which that's crazy to believe that I've been podcasting that long. And we do mastermind groups, which are small groups of leaders that meet on a consistent basis for at least 1 year to help each other grow. So we run those. And then we also have a one-day leadership conference that we launched a few years ago here in Pittsburgh as well. So that's those 2. And then obviously my family life is very, very good. So that's me.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. So what are some of the things you guys do for the homeless community there in Pittsburgh through life? Like what all does that involve for you and the organization?
Yeah, so we say as an organization, 2 things set us apart as far as how we serve the homeless. One is we are a faith-based organization. Now, that does not mean you have to be a faith-based person to come through our doors to be served there or even to volunteer there. But it does mean that Christ is very important to us. And so we're faith-based. And then the second thing that sets us apart and how we actually serve is our continuum of care. And what our continuum of care is, and what that means is no matter where someone is in their homelessness journey, we want to have a next step for them. And so that starts with our street outreach team. We have a team that goes out to the homeless and camps on streets on a daily basis, just to build relationships with them in hopes that through time, we'll build the trust that when they're actually ready to come in for services, we'll be there and we'll be able to help them. And then we have emergency services. So we just built a brand new shelter last year where we house on a daily basis 50 men, women, and children. We also have a meal ministry where we provide 250 to 300 meals a day to those in need, as well as a food pantry that serves our community. And then we also have long-term programming for men, women, and children, which is highly focused on recovery. And these men and women live with us anywhere from 9 months to 2 years. And we help them recover. We help them get an education, whatever that looks like. We help them get a job. And ultimately, we help them get housing and get back on their feet again. And then they graduate our program. And hopefully, sometimes we hire some of our graduates, and then other times our graduates become alumni and actually come back and serve the very same men and women who may have been that are in the shoes that they were in just a few years ago. And so that's kind of an 80,000 foot level of what we do at Light of Life.
Making a great impact there, and you guys are involved in a lot of different ways. When you're talking about your street ministry and when they're ready to come to you, is that when you start working with them to try to help educate them? Is that kind of how that works?
It really just depends on what their needs are. And it's interesting, people always ask about, what's it like for those living on the street. A lot of people living in camps don't actually want services. They don't want help until they do. It's an extreme example, but there was a mayor of a homeless camp. Yeah, they actually have systems set up. There was a mayor named Shocker in Pittsburgh. And for 17 years, he lived on the streets. He lived in homeless camps, never wanted help until one day he did. And so one day out of nowhere, he said, I'm ready. I want help. And for him, he didn't necessarily need our long-term recovery program. He just needed housing. And so we were able to help get him the housing that he needed. And he ended up becoming a longtime volunteer and again, serving those who were coming off the streets where he came from. And so he was able to make a huge, significant difference. So yeah, for us, we say that everything we do, we want to provide hope. So whether that's meeting someone on the street, providing a meal, we hope that that gives them the hope they need to know that they don't have to stay where they are. They can actually take a next step, and there's hope that tomorrow can be better than today. And so no matter what that next step looks like for them, we try to help them take it.
That's awesome. You said you've been with Light of Life for 11 years?
That's correct.
So I don't think you started as a director of development there. How'd you end up getting started with them to begin with and end up in the place you are now?
Yeah, so my background, I was in staff at a church and youth ministry, and my dream was I wanted to be a mega church pastor. I feel like every 20-something's dream who wants to go into ministry. And I was on staff at a large church and ended up leaving there to help one of my mentors plant a church. And unfortunately, he couldn't pay me at the time. It was just starting from scratch. And he said, listen, you either need to raise your own salary or get a job. And so I said, hey, I'll just get a job. And I wanted to get a job in business because I felt like those were skills that I could acquire that could help me grow. Long story short, a door opened up to work at Light of Life. A woman actually went to the church I was on staff at, and she said, hey, I know you're looking for a job. I know you're not looking long term, but why don't you come and just work for the mission for you? And the job that was open was the volunteer coordinator. And so I was responsible for, coordinating over 1,000 volunteers a year, which I am, I didn't know it at the time how bad I am administratively, but I am terrible. So I felt bad for every volunteer that I interacted with. But I will say what was a strength was that I was good with people. And so about a year into my time there, I think everyone realized that long-term, I wasn't going to be a volunteer coordinator, but people said, Doug, you're really good with people. You should try fundraising. We need a major gift officer. Would you consider taking that role? And so I jumped into a fundraising position, never fundraised in my entire life. And that ended up going really, really well. They just threw me into the deep end and said, figure it out. And so I ended up, being able to raise a lot of money. And then ultimately they started saying, hey, we're not going to be able to keep this guy if we don't give him more responsibility. And so they made me a manager. And then one day it was actually interesting. One day the position for the director opened up and I actually didn't want it. I was going to go full time with my side business, L3, but I felt like God spoke to me one morning and said, Doug, you need to pick up the ball and run with it. This is extremely important for your development. And so I went for the job and got it. And wow, if I had to develop over the last 4 years in that role, it's been quite a stretch, but it's probably been the best thing for me as far as leadership development is concerned.
Going from a volunteer coordinator all the way to where you are now, it just proves that anything can happen. You're willing to stick with it, kind of stay in the game, and move up. So,
and Jeremy, I think this will help your listeners. Let me share this. The other thing I didn't mention about this story was when I went to Light of Life, I had no dreams of being a director of development. I actually had I would say an identity crisis. I think I was 26 years old. And I literally was depressed for the first 6 to 12 months I was on staff at Light of Life because I was no longer on staff at a big church. I saw no path to me becoming what I wanted to become, which was a mega church pastor. And I was just depressed. I actually told a friend, like, what am I doing at this homeless shelter? Like, my life is a mess. I'm not going anywhere. And I was miserable. And about 1 year in, when they started having conversations about me being a fundraiser, I really felt like the Lord said to me, hey, I'm calling you to Light of Life. And I started falling in love with homeless ministry, started falling in love with that. Also, At the same time, I have a younger sister. Now, I don't have time to share my whole story, but in high school, I was a drug dealer, heavy into drugs. And my senior year of high school, my mom ended up passing away, and I rededicated my life to Christ through that experience. And my life kind of turned around. Unfortunately, my sister, I have a younger sister, she kept going down the same path we were both headed. So fast forward, I'm on staff at Light of Life for a year. My sister comes to me. She's 5 months pregnant with my nephew, and she starts crying. And she says, "Doug, I need help." And I said, "What do you mean you need help?" She said, "I need help. I'm a heroin addict." And I had no idea what to do. I had done drugs, but never got into heroin. And for 9 years, I reached out to Light of Life, and I said, I had a program director, and I said, "Can you help?" And for 9 years, Light of Life walked me, my family, and my sister through my sister's addiction. My sister ended up homeless twice in that 9 year period in our programming 3 different times. And the third time was doing really, really well, rededicated her life to Christ, was clean for 17 months. But unfortunately, after that 17 months, she relapsed and went downhill. And ultimately, unfortunately, we lost my sister to an overdose in 2019. But because of Light of Life, I know my sister knows Christ, and I'll see her again. But what I want leaders to hear is, and I know I went through that very quickly, but I think I would tell leaders, my pastor would always tell me, "Doug, never put a period where God puts a comma." And what he meant by that is, for me in my life, I put a period in my life. I said, I'm going to be a mega church pastor. I'm going to be that leader and nothing else. Like, that's all I can be. God put a comma in my life and said, "What if I have something different for you?" And so now looking back on the journey, I'm like, oh my goodness, one, from a leadership development standpoint, like, I don't know that I could have developed the skills that I have now had I stayed on the path that I was going. Two, the way I'm wired, for me, I think being just on staff at a single church would be very challenging for me. I'm a big 80,000 foot view. I love seeing what God's doing all over our city. And for me at Light of Life, I get that experience every day. And so I guess what I would say to your listeners is, God can write a better story for your life than you can. And if you would have told me that I'd be, director of development at Light of Life and be leading everything that I'm leading today, I would have never believed you. And I certainly wouldn't have believed I'd be happy or fulfilled. But I can tell you that I'm happier now, and I can't imagine living a different life. And I'm so grateful that I was open to God putting a comma in my life when I just wanted to put a period, and it's meant everything. So be open to even trying things that you've never tried before. God might have an entirely different path for you that you couldn't have even imagined a few years ago.
How has that openness helped you lead? Because you said you've learned a ton, especially over the last 4 years in this new role as the director. How has that helped you in your L3 side of things and in your leadership development, how you're reaching out to leaders, not only just Pittsburgh, but really all around the country and elsewhere?
I would say Light of Life, the way I've actually had mentors talk to me about my leadership path is really, I believe God's allowed Light of Life to be my laboratory for leadership. So I'm not just a theory person. Now, I believe you can lead at any age. I absolutely believe that's true. But I remember in my 20s as a young leader. And again, when you're a young leader, you don't have experience. You don't have wisdom. All you have is energy and passion and enthusiasm. And, I started trying to teach leadership when I was in my early 20s. And I added value to people, but I'd have older leaders actually mock me and tease me of like, "What do you actually know about leadership?" Nothing. But I would say that it was still important that I developed in that way and taught what I knew, because I still made an impact. And that was actually part of my development. But I would just say that, every time I'm passionate about leadership development, but every time I've tried to go full time with L3, I really feel like God has intervened and basically just said, "It's not your time yet." I mentioned when I became director, my plan was to go full time, and God spoke to me on my run. It happened another time where I thought, "Hey, now it's time." And God said, "No, it's not." And I think a lot of times we want to get ahead of but if we don't develop where we are, the skills and the attitudes and everything that we need to develop in the season we're at, we're not going to be prepared for that next season. So I would just say, I do believe long-term, and I don't know when this will be. I do believe I'll be focused on L3 leadership or something like it, some organization adding value to leaders. But until then, I feel like God still is saying to me, "You have a lot more development to go than you think you do. So just keep being faithful. And when it's time for you to go, you'll know." Like, I just feel like I will know, and I won't have to question it. It'll be easy and light, and I'll just be able to step into it. Versus the past 10 years, the times that it's been frustrating. Is it time? Is it not right? I didn't have a peace about it. And so that's kind of how I process that.
I want to dive into that just a little bit, if you don't mind.
Sure.
You said that
Yeah.
you were on a run. You were getting ready to make the jump. Went for a run, and you heard God speak and say, "Hey, now's not the time." And you've mentioned that a couple of times. How do you hear His voice?
Mhm.
Because there's so much. We have so many distractions, and people hear you hear people talk all the time. Well, how do I know if God's truly speaking to me right now in this moment of my life? When they hit some of those decision points, what does that process look like for you to actually hear that and be like, nope, that's God talking. I need to keep going down this path versus
Yeah.
taking my own.
No, that's so good. And a lot of people will ask that. And let me just be clear for those who may not be believers or saying, what is this guy talking about? It's not like I heard this audible voice from heaven saying, Doug, don't go, it's not time yet. Like that's not it. But the Bible says that if we're a child of God, we can hear from God. And oftentimes it's just promptings coming from inside of us. And for me, my experience has been, I'm in a mastermind group with a bunch of pastors, and I was processing one day of like, hey, should I go full time L3 or should I stay at Light of Light? Going back and forth with this. And one of the pastors said to me, he said, Doug, it seems like when you need advice or when you're processing a big decision in your life, that you turn up the dial and you turn up the volume of other people and you ask everyone. And this is exactly what I do. Jeremy, I would ask you, hey, what do you think about this? If I'm having coffee with this person or this leader, what do you think? I basically want other people to tell me what to do. And this leader said, Doug, what you need to do is turn that dial down and turn up the dial of God and get quiet and hear Him. And I have a lot of trouble with that. If you were to ask me, I know you want to talk about the retreat. My biggest challenge in my walk with God is taking time to get quiet, is taking time to pray, because I'm a person of action and wisdom, right? I want, give me the principle, give me something to do, and let's go kill something and let's go. But for me to actually take time to be quiet, I've actually had a goal over the last 5 years to take a silent retreat, and I never did, because I would schedule them and then something more exciting would come up and I'd say, that sounds a lot more fun than a silent retreat. But I would say this, that when I do give God time and be quiet, that's when He speaks to me. And most recently, I was on a retreat with actually all these pastors. And it was the first time we were in Montana. I was away from everything. I unplugged completely. And we spent 2 hours. Now, this sounds a lot for listeners probably, but we spent 2 hours a day in prayer and worship. It was the first time I ever did that in my life. But when I actually got quiet and gave God the time, He spoke to me. And so that's where I am now. And I would just say you have to take that time. But, when I talked about the director position, I think it was just, I think I do love God with all my heart. And I think if you're following God, Mark Batterson often says that God wants you to get where God wants you to go more than you do. And so God will make sure you go and stay on the right path. And so I think, I didn't take time at that point. I was just on a run, but that's just where I was. And I think God was saving me from making a great mistake. So I would just say, if you follow God, He'll speak to your heart. He'll give you promptings. Turn up the dial of God, turn down the dial of people.
I think all too often we rely on everybody else and everything else, from social media to close friends, masterminds, anything and everything to try to give us the answers. I know I'm just as guilty. I am just so that's good. You talk about L3 and you guys have been around for 7 years. Is that about right?
Yes.
You started kind of slow. You started out, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, but with kind of a monthly leadership breakfast. I think you had less than 10 people show for your first one. You started a podcast, and over the course of time, you're now partnering up with organizations like Man Up, which is Mike Tomlin's organization he has for dads. And anybody who doesn't know Mike Tomlin, he's the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. You mentioned earlier you host your annual one-day leadership event. You bring in speakers and thought leaders from all over the country and speak to folks there in Pittsburgh. And your podcast has gone from 1 or 2 a month to now you've got a weekly podcast, and you mentioned that as well. Talk to me about that journey. Like you said, that's the side hustle. That's the side gig. Talk to me about that journey and some of the ups and downs you've been through along the way throughout that.
Yeah. If you want to hear the whole journey. So when I was 17 years old, I told you I was a drug dealer. My life was going nowhere. Literally, I thought I was either going to be a janitor or a bus driver. My dad's a bus driver, and clearly nothing wrong with either of those professions, but that's just what I thought I was going to do. And I turned my life around when my mom died my senior year of high school, and I rededicated my life to Christ. And I actually ended up having a mentor come into my life and tell me, hey, you're a leader. You influence people. You can change the world. If you'll just grow and develop as a leader, you'll be shocked at what God can do in and through your life. And he handed me a John Maxwell CD. If you don't know John Maxwell, he's an international best-selling author, leadership guru. And I didn't know there was such thing as personal development. I never heard of it in my life, reading books, like all foreign to me. So he gives me this, it was a tape. And I put the tape in and I hit play and I listened to one of John's lessons. It was the most amazing thing I've ever listened to in my life. I transcribed the entire thing word for word because I didn't know it came with notes. And I called my mentor immediately and I said, give me everything you have, everything. And so he gave me binders full of John Maxwell CDs. And literally, I'm not joking. I was this 18-year-old kid listening to 2 or 3 hours of John Maxwell a night. In fact, I remember I was still, partying and living that life. And I had a party in my house one night. And I was so excited about this. I told all my friends, I said, fellas, listen, I know we usually get drunk and high every night, but tonight I have something even better. You're going to love this. And they're like, what is it? And I handed out copies of notes and I put in the 21 Irrefutable Laws of Leadership on DVD into my DVD player. And I said, watch this. We're going to take notes. It's going to change your life. And, I can see you laughing. Needless to say, no one thought it was funny and no one thought it was life-changing. They all just went and got drunk and high while I sat there. And I'm like, this is amazing. So I would say that was actually, when you talk about L3, it actually started with me developing a passion. And from that, and from really John's teaching, when I was 18, I thought, this is what I want to do. I want to add value to leaders. I want to influence people to help transform their lives. And so from a very early age, I felt like God gave me a dream. Now, it took a long time for that dream to come to pass. And it's still, a long time, but that was 17. I think I was 10 years ago. I was 27 when I started the podcast. And so I'm giving you context because I think this will be helpful for leaders. But one of the things my mentor did, Larry, he would bring in leaders from the community, such as yourself. And he would say, Doug, if Jeremy really, influenced you today and made an impact, you should ask Jeremy out to coffee, ask him to mentor you, come with a list of questions. He gave us this whole process for getting mentored by leaders, which was phenomenal. And so I started doing that. And for 10 years, every single month, I would have learning lunches or breakfasts with leaders and just learn from them and ask them to mentor me. And it was amazing. And all of a sudden, after 10 years, I started being able to connect with some really high level leaders. And all of my peers started saying, Doug, I wish I could spend time with Jeremy. I wish I could spend time with this leader, Mike Tomlin, whoever. And I would say, well, you probably could. Have you ever asked them? And 99% of the time they'd say, no, I've never asked someone to mentor me in my life. And I'm like, well, there you go. Start where you're at. But I saw that as an opportunity and almost a whisper from God of what if I started recording my conversations with leaders and put it out there for other people to listen to. This was what I say is before podcasting was cool. And so this was in 2012. So technically this was before I started L3. It was actually when I launched the podcast, it was called the Learning to Lead podcast. And the sound quality is terrible, but it's really, really cool to look back. But yeah, I just started with one interview a month and I did that for about 3 years. And listen, I got like 0 listens. I loved looking back at my stats and seeing that I had like 30 listens the entire month, 30 downloads. But I didn't care because I just thought, hey, if I can add value to one person, that 30 downloads, that's 30 people that I could have influenced. And so I'm just going to keep being faithful with what I have. And so that was the podcast. And then I really got a vision in my heart for our city. And so my wife, I actually didn't want to do this. My wife put a Facebook announcement out there saying, we're going to have a Learning to Lead vision night on Mount Washington. And so this is just, how powerful it is to have a great spouse who believes in you or great friends. She forced me and put it out there publicly that I was going to have a night to cast vision for this dream called L3 Leadership. And so, as you mentioned, we had 14 people show up on a platform and I cast vision that, hey, we are going to develop leaders and equip them and we're going to follow them. And if we do that for 5, 10, 15, 20 years and develop leaders in our city, we can change our whole city and we'll have leaders influencing everyone in every sector of society. This whole vision for 14 people. And then everyone left. It was just me and my wife again. And that was the start. So humble beginnings. And we started with one mastermind group. I'll never forget it. It was the biggest. The diversity in the group was hilarious. We had an executive vice president of a global company, who's doing millions of dollars in revenue every year. And then we had a 14-year-old kid in our mastermind group who his biggest goal that year was to cut more grass. Like that's literally what he said. But it's just been a blast. So that one mastermind group has gone on to, we probably had over 40 or 50 mastermind groups throughout the history of L3. And then I've always had a vision to do a conference. And again, just had some mentors come into my life and tell me that I could do it and launched that in 2019. And so it's just been taking one step at a time. And I would say, you asked about the ups and downs. For me, I really had to overcome not finding my value in numbers. I talked about the podcast only has 34 listens. At first, I didn't care because I was just doing it out of passion. But once you start getting into it, I remember sitting at breakfast, like you're talking about, we would host these monthly breakfasts and there'd be 10 people there. And I'd have the CEO in from some organization. I'm like, man, I just wasted this guy's time. And I would actually be writing in my journal during the breakfast, like, my value is not in how many people are here. My value is not in how many people are here. And it was really just coming to a point where I had to come to a place where, hey, whether I influence one person or 10 million people, I'm doing what God put me on the earth to do, and I'm just going to be happy and content with that. And so overcoming that and not finding my identity in the wrong places has probably been the biggest obstacle for me.
No, that's so good, because I think especially in today's society, it's so easy to get caught up in, I got to impact millions right out of the gate.
Right.
And the reality is that's just not going to happen for the vast majority of people. So I think it's great to be able to say, no, it's okay. If I'm impacting one, then that's enough.
Yeah. And Jeremy, I'll say this, you have a podcast for leaders. You're passionate about leadership development. The beautiful thing about influencing leaders is when you influence a leader, you're not just influencing one, you're influencing everyone that leader influences. So indirectly, you may be influencing tens of thousands of people and not even know it. And that's what I love about developing leaders. It's just absolutely huge. And I always tell people, it's not always how many you influence, it's also who you influence. Like, you could be influencing someone that literally goes off and changes the world. And so Gary Vaynerchuk has this great video that I probably have watched 10,000 times to help me overcome this. It's called 1 is Greater Than 0. And he basically just talks about, hey, are you willing to do a podcast like this for an hour to get 10 lessons? I am. Because even though it might only be 10 lessons, it only takes one lesson to be the right lesson. And there might be a producer from CNN that listens to this interview and calls you and gives you your big break. And you just never know when that's going to come. So just keep adding value to people and keep showing up, and the rest will take care of itself.
I appreciate you sharing that. I hope you enjoyed part 1 of my interview with Doug Smith. It was great to hear what all he and the Light of Life Rescue Mission is doing in the city of Pittsburgh. It was great to learn how he started so humbly and how he continues to just grow his business, and how he's willing to, at this point, find his who, not his how, and outsource things that he needs to in order to be more effective as a leader in both Light of Life, L3, and at home. We appreciate Doug's time so much, and we look forward to part 2 of our interview next month. Today's Bible verse comes from Galatians 6:9, and it says, "Let us not become weary in doing good, for at the proper time we will reap a harvest if we do not give up." Doug's a prime example of that. He just stayed faithful. He stayed the course. He knew he had a vision, and he stuck with it. Early on, 30 listeners maybe with his podcast, 1 a month. And now he's to a point where he's doing a podcast every single week, thousands of followers, and creating an impact larger than he can even imagine. You can do the same as long as you're willing to stay the course and not give up. You guys have a great month, and we'll see you next time on the Mullins Mustard Podcast.